early childhood development. Each week we talk about a different stage of children development and what children need. And now, here comes your host.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Taryn, and you are listening to The Parenting. We are still on the road to the inner child, and I've got Marion Makepeace back with me this week. Welcome back, Marion.
Good to be here. Thanks, Taryn.
Have you had a good week?
I've just been very conscious of how important this information that we're talking about is. I haven't actually sat down previously and kind of packaged it all together as we're doing now.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing just how much information there actually is that parents need to know.
Right.
I hope they're finding bite-sized chunks makes it more digestible.
Absolutely. I mean, we've covered so much in the last 3 weeks, right? We spoke about ego states in transactional analysis. We spoke about the inner parent, the inner adult, the inner child. We've spoken about how nurturing can go wrong. And then last week, we started diving into how the role of the guiding parent can go wrong. Can you give us a brief, summary of what we've covered so far? And I know we spoke about the wild child and how it's created. So do you just want to summarize our past couple of weeks together real quick?
Well, I kind of don't know how to do it all that quickly, but essentially the whole purpose of this exercise is to recognize that how we are parented lays down those factory settings in our heads for how to do life going forward. And so that's why it's important for parents to know how it can go wrong and what to avoid. And as I said to you already previously, I think parenting is probably the most responsible job we ever do. And yet it's the one we have the least amount of training in.
Right.
So hopefully giving people this information will enable them to know better, right? What to be aware of. Okay.
Yeah.
So a child who is, that what we focused last week on the guiding aspect of parenting, and I'm afraid that's going to be where the primary focus for this week is as well, and possibly even next week. Depends how fast we can get through this stuff. But the wild child is one of the first consequences of unhealthy parenting, and it's the result of neglect.
Mm-hmm.
So here you can get a neglect to notice because the parents are too busy, distracted, overwhelmed with the other things. And we had an enormous amount of this happening during COVID, as I mentioned, where parents are having to work online. And so they just couldn't pay attention to their kids.
Right.
So they can neglect to notice, or they can neglect to respond with an injunction, in other words, a no to unacceptable behavior. Or they can respond with a no, but not an alternative, so the child still has no further information for how to do better. Or they can neglect to praise, in other words, to reinforce good behavior by taking it for granted. And in an unbalanced way, to focus on the negative and take for granted the positive, which effectively reinforces the negative with the reward of attention, because we all want attention, and any attention is better than none. Remember that what I said to you was that indifference is actually the opposite of love. So a child will do anything rather than if that's all they'll get. So those neglect patterns create the unruly or wild child. In other words, the child that hasn't been socialized adequately.
Yeah.
And I think any teacher in a classroom, when their kids went back after COVID, was dealing with a room full of unruly children.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think the biggest problem going forward, though, I think that perhaps we need to focus on today, having identified neglect as one cause, is how the parent responds. That's really, I think, more important. So they need to respond, so which means they need to notice and then they need to respond.
Right.
and they need to respond appropriately.
Right. So that's the meat of this week's assignment that we have, right? We're going to get into more of how the unhealthy guiding aspect of parenting can affect a child negatively. So you just said that a parent needs to respond to a child. But let's talk about how when a parent doesn't respond, when a parent responds like very little or is inconsistent or doesn't respond at all, never mind very little. So how does a minimal response from a parent make the child feel like they aren't good enough? Like, is that the consequence? What is the consequence of not responding to your child appropriately or not responding at all?
Well, neglect definitely creates the sense that I don't matter and it doesn't matter. So you're doing a certain degree of permission by default. So that's what happened, as I said, during COVID, was there was permission to do whatever by default because the parents just weren't responding. They were distracted by having to work from home, most of them. So if the kids were drawing on the wall or beating each other up or pulling the cat's tail or, swinging the dog by its tail, it was okay. So there was a failure to respond, but there was also an absence of praise. There was an absence of attention, which, as I said, is indifference and which makes the child feel not cared about. We all want to be seen, to be noticed, to be recognized, and ideally acknowledged. What in transactional analysis is a need to be stroked.
Yeah.
So what happens then is that you've got an out of control child. And as I said, I think all teachers I know of were moaning like crazy. It's taken them 6 months to get the kids under control again.
Absolutely.
And also,
it was quite a challenge.
Not only that, but I think what's also come up is that the kids are way behind because they weren't rewarded for doing their schoolwork either. There was no incentivizing, there was no reward. So they were behind and out of control.
Not just that, Marion, parents, I saw it because we had online classes. I saw how parents were actually doing the work for their children. That's a whole nother story for a whole nother day.
Oh, no, we will be talking about that. We will be talking about that.
How that doesn't help the child at all. But you said something so that triggered something in me. You said when a parent fails to respond, it creates a narrative in the child that I don't matter and this doesn't matter. And I think that's why we have so many lost adults now, because we didn't get the attention that we needed, but then that makes us not so much intrinsically motivated, right? Because it doesn't matter, right? So we're not motivated. Like even children in school, they're not motivated to do well in school because they have this narrative that it doesn't matter. And then going into like the big world, real life, I find that lots of people don't have the motivation to do something for themselves because they're still waiting for somebody to come and give them that approval, for someone to give them that motivation. So there's still that need for external motivation because it wasn't given enough. They don't have the internal motivation to do it. Does that make sense?
Well, yes. And I think the cause is slightly different because a lot of the time this is a whole can of worms that I think we probably need to tackle later.
Okay.
Once all of this is explained. And the reason I say that is because it's the integration of all the aspects of parenting that we need to talk about. And one of these things is that learning discipline is part of self-care. And so that's a whole separate conversation, because self-care is not face masks and bubble baths. It's about doing the tough stuff, as we said last week, I think, or the week before, I can't remember.
Yeah.
Self-care is being able to care enough about yourself to get things done that need to be done. And but when the child doesn't feel like they're worth it because they are not noticed and what they do is not noticed, their sense of self-worth, their sense of value is damaged. And so they will not be incentivized to do anything, and they won't learn how to incentivize themselves. I mean, we all know what motivates, because
Mhm.
when a baby's learning to walk, and I've used that analogy more than once, but it's absolutely the best example I know. When a baby starts to speak and it says its first dada or mama, everyone gets madly enthusiastic. They don't get upset when the child is crying, but they get enthusiastic when the child responds in a way that they want.
Yeah.
They start to make those first tottery steps as well. Wild enthusiasm for that, and being unexcited by the falling down. That is how you motivate, and all humans are motivated like that. But somewhere, something, we lose the plot. So instead of catching them doing something right, we then pounce on them when they're doing something wrong, and we take the doing right for granted.
Right. So that's what I was going to ask you, because you said that often parents fail to respond, but very often when parents do respond, they are responding to what the child is doing wrong. And I just feel like what you feed will grow. So if you're going to be feeding the incorrect behavior, that's what's going to grow, because that's what's getting their attention. So can we go into like positive versus negative reinforcement? Because I truly do believe that, what you feed grows.
Well, let's start with what I would call the perfectionism problem.
Mm-hmm.
So children are learning, and when you're learning, you're not perfect, right? You're clumsy, but you celebrate the successes, like those first tottery steps, and you ignore the failures, all the times they fall down. That's the best way to do it. But when you have a yes but parent, or you have yes but parenting, they might positively acknowledge something that the child has done, but then they go on to criticize. So there's the pat, then the slap, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So when that happens often, the child gets the impression that they can never quite get it right, that they're not good enough, right? So my favorite example is a close family member in my family with her son, who, when he finished school, right, he did 8 subjects, which is a lot. And one
Mm-hmm.
of them was music, which is kind of 3 subjects in its own right. He got 7 A's. How he did that, I still do not know. But he got 7 A's and 1 D. And his mother's response was, great about the A's, but why did you get a D?
Ouch. I think a lot of us
Well, I
grew
mean,
up
you
that
should
way,
have
though.
got an A for that. I know. So that yes, but there's a complete imbalance. There should have been 7 hurrahs, in fact, actually probably 9, and 1, yeah, pity about that one. But it was completely disproportionate. The other thing, I mean, for anyone to have achieved 7 A's, in my opinion, was absolutely miraculous. And the subject that he got the D in was, probably the least important anyway. So it's that yes, but that I'm talking about, right? That minimal response to desirable behavior and an overemphasis on the negative, that terribly unbalanced approach. And the problem with perfectionism is that it really creates chronic stress for the child. They are still encouraged because there is an acknowledgement, but it's packaged with but, right? And so the constant moving of the goalposts, right, is exhausting for them. And you land up with a child who's chronically anxious, desperately keen to try and get it right, but never feeling like they can. Oh, you must find parents who do that to your kids, or do have done that with the kids that you teach.
Absolutely. And you saying the yes, but like when you say they are motivated because there was some kind of acknowledgement, I find that, speaking from experience, I wasn't positively motivated. Like it wasn't a healthy motivation. It was like I am not good enough until I get that next A. So even though there was an acknowledgement of the other ones, it's still it's a bullying myself. It's a beating myself into getting it right completely. And even if you improve those marks, or get better in that. It's still not good enough because there's another but that comes. Like every time you raise the bar, the but is you need to raise it a little higher. And so that brings me into parents having unrealistic expectations of their children and how that affects their children. And if we look at developmental stages of children, I find that you said earlier that when the child just starts walking and the falling happens, like people still cheer the walking and they ignore the falling, right? But I find that there is the shift when we get into toddlerhood, the 2s and 3s, when a child starts talking, there's the shift that parents have that, oh, because you can talk, it means you have the ability to do everything else. You have the ability to communicate properly. You have the ability. That's the shift that parents have. They start expecting a lot more from children. So an example I have is somebody in my family as well had a toddler at the time, and she says to me, like, I cannot handle how much he cries for everything he wants. If he wants juice, he's crying. When there's no reason to cry, he's crying. And I said, just because he can speak doesn't mean he knows how to use his words. That's where you come in and teach him. So instead of yelling at him when he's crying, just say to him, can you say juice, please? Or however many words he has to string the sentence together. Because up until that point, the way that he got attention, the way that he communicated that he had a need was to cry. So just because he has the words doesn't mean he knows how to use that. And so I find that in each developmental stage, parents have these absolutely unrealistic expectations on children, and that affects them negatively as well. Can we get into that?
Absolutely. So I think it's very important to know what a child is capable of and know what to praise. Again, you and I both are on the same page with this one. The importance of knowing the basics of childhood development stages is really essential as a parent. So you know what's reasonable to expect. You know what the child's capable of, what they should have mastered, and what they're busy working with. So that's what needs to be reinforced with acknowledgement and praise. Because the bottom line is, right, we all want acknowledgement and praise, okay? So if you take desired behavior for granted, ignore it, right, and don't respond, especially if it's a new behavior, and the only thing you react to is the inadequate or unacceptable or undesirable behavior, you're going to reinforce that instead. And so my guess is that mother was only responding when her child cried, and she wasn't responding before that or when the child did say juice. So it's hard to be exact, but without watching the situation.
Right.
But I would say that, for example, you're not going to get excited when a 7-year-old walks, because they've been walking for 6 years roughly, unless of course they're recovering from a broken leg. But you will get enthusiastic when the baby takes its first tottery steps. And you don't criticize a baby for falling down at that stage, right? So what we should be doing is lots of praise for what the child is busy mastering at that stage. And if you don't know what that is, how do you know what to get excited about? Right? So it's very important that, people do find out about developmental stages, and that they understand what the child needs to be being shown and taught. There is no point in discussing the complexities of Shakespeare with a 7-year-old. They won't understand one word.
Right.
But you can, as we do with children, you start with teaching language, first with nouns. So we label things: cat, dog, horse, cow, house, car, etc. And then we say, look, the dog's running. Look, the horse is neighing. And we talk about what they do as the next stage. And I teach language in stages. So when the child then points at their nose and says nose, and where are your ears? And they point at their ears, you get excited. But you would expect a 5-year-old to know where their nose and their ears and their toes are. But you certainly don't expect that in a toddler. So it's what to respond to and when, right?
Yeah.
And unrealistic expectations. Yeah, sorry, Karen.
No, I was saying I witnessed an incident the other day. Well, not the other day, not too long ago, that completely broke my heart. So I was at a friend's house and they have a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old was having some yogurt, but the yogurt, it was in the morning, fell out of her hands and obviously spilt on the floor, and her dad went ballistic. Started yelling at her, like name calling, like just bashing this little girl because she dropped the yogurt. He then proceeded to take her cereal that she was eating and threw that out too because she dropped this yogurt. And then the mom got involved and was like, it was an accident. She should know better. And he just went off on this little 3-year-old for dropping yogurt. And so I think it's so important that parents need to remember that their children are just as human as they are, and mistakes happen and accidents happen. Like, she didn't walk in and throw the yogurt down in a tantrum, or do you know what I mean? It was an innocent mistake. And seeing that, I was just like, oh my gosh, this now becomes a core memory in this child.
Okay, so you must remember that we only have the function of our opposable thumb kick in around about the age of 2. Children before that age cannot use a pair of scissors, for example, because they need to have the thumb oppose their fingers to be able to hold things properly. So at the age of 3, they're still clumsy. That father's expectations were completely unrealistic, right? Which is very sad, because that little girl would have been shouted at for something that really she would have been expected to be clumsy at if the parents had known the developmental stage. This causes the child to start doubting themselves. I mean, nobody would get upset with a 6-month-old baby for not packing their clothes away neatly, because they know the child doesn't have the ability to do that. And yet parents often expect a child to be patient at the age of 2 or 3, when the child has no concept of time, or to be able to understand a consequence and make a wise choice, when they're far too young to understand consequentiality. In other words, if I do this, then that's likely to happen, so I better not do this, right? That doesn't kick in even slightly much before the age of 5. I think the most terrible thing I experienced was the child of a family, my husband's senior journeyman. The mother took the son away when he was 18 months old to meet her family. And the child was landing up in hospital, and they couldn't find the cause of the problem. And I said, he thinks his father's dead. Do you know that? Please let him talk to his father on a video call.
On the phone, yeah.
Well, not just the sound, but he needed to see him. The minute he saw his father, he started laughing and crying. He was completely fixated on his father, because he'd actually been with his father more than he'd been with his mother, who'd been actually quite ill after he was born. And suddenly he'd been whisked away from his father. The child had no idea that he was coming back, because the concept of time didn't exist for him yet. So the fact that he didn't see his father felt like eternity. The moment he could see his father, the child got well, because later doesn't mean anything to a child under the age of 2.5, 3.
Yeah.
They have no concept of time, which is why when you go out of the room, it's forever. And that's why they get clingy, because they have the separation process.
Right, that's where the separation anxiety comes in.
And they don't know that you'll come back, because they have no concept of that yet. Everything is now. So yeah, it's really important to understand. Kids, when they're little, do not understand those things. And if you're expecting them to, and demanding that they do, and getting angry when they don't, you've got a very overwhelmed child.
Right.
Now starts to think they're not capable.
Right. So it creates this lack of confidence in the child when a parent demands that a child does what they can't yet do, or that they don't have the capacity or the capability of doing it.
So I think it's very important to understand that when you get chronic criticism, which usually is shaming, because what you were talking about, that father doing to his daughter when she dropped the yogurt, was shaming, all right? Why didn't you? Why have you? Why? With the implication, the implied message, you should have, right?
Yeah.
And so the response is very negative. And yet the child doesn't have the capacity to do anything differently. That constant and reasonable criticism, right? And especially without clear guidance on what to do instead, that is achievable, creates that crushed child, the one who never feels good enough. And as adults, what you get is a people pleaser. desperate for approval and never confident of achieving it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know many people like that.
I know me. I'm like that.
Mm. Well, not so much now, Taryn, thank
Not as
heavens.
much as I used to be. No.
Indeed. But yeah, it's that. So, you do have to look at the reality that knowing what the child can do, is able to do, will tell you, first of all, what they're in the process of mastering and requires enthusiastic praise and encouragement. And also what is realistic to expect and what you need to understand they just can't do. They're not being willfully difficult. They simply do not have the capacity to do. And so not to make an unrealistic or unreasonable demand on the child and shame them for not being able to deliver against those unrealistic expectations.
Absolutely. Marion, can we speak about parents setting rules and boundaries and actually sticking to that with their children? Because I find that I see like a lot of parents will give an answer to a child and say, no, you can't have a cookie, for example. And the kid will, like you said, they don't have the concept of waiting or the later or whatever. So the child will keep nagging and nagging and nagging. And then so often the parent gives in and gives the child said cookie or whatever the case is, right? And I feel like this is the stage where you're supposed to put those boundaries in place so the child can respect your no, right? But if you keep giving in after they nag a little bit, that then tells the child that should I continue nagging, I'm going to get what I want.
Okay, well, what you're talking about are all flavors of inconsistent parenting.
Yeah.
And inconsistent parenting is a really disturbing thing because what it creates, unfortunately, ultimately is a child who doesn't respect authority. In certain circumstances, some other pretty nasty. Let's work through the list of how this can play out. And so the first pattern of inconsistency is that the parents model different behavior from what they're asking from their child. So if you tell your child not to kick the dog and you to pat it gently and you show the child how to do that and you're happy when they do that, but you kick the dog, the child gets confused.
Mm-hmm.
That message is contradictory. And the biggest problem is children will copy what they see because, as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words and a movie even more, right? And what they're watching, therefore, has a much more powerful impact than what you tell them. So, as I've said before, and I'm going to say again, probably 100 more times, right? You need to be aware that children are modeling you. And I mean, I know, I'm sure you know this from working in a classroom, especially with, the junior primary school children. You know what's going on in that family by watching how that child behaves.
Yeah.
Not always.
I had a little girl in one of my classes. Her mom was studying. I was aware of the fact that her mom was studying because her mom had to travel to another country to write her final exams. But this little girl sat on my chair and she was at my desk and she had her head down and she was like writing, obviously scribbling. She was 4. She was writing and scribbling at my desk and I came and I was like, hey, could you get off my chair and so that I can sit on my chair? And she looked up at me and super angry, she said, why are you bothering me? Can't you see that I'm studying? Just leave me alone. And I knew exactly what was going on in that house in that moment.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's it. They will do, right? Copying rather than instructions. So it's all very well telling a child to do something, but that isn't what sticks. They will copy your behavior.
Absolutely. I mean, every year in all my classes, because I teach the littlies, and in all my classes every year, there comes a point where they start imitating me and they start speaking to each other the way I speak to them, and they start conducting like their little play circle times and doing exactly as every year I see it.
Yeah. And that's the whole point. We are actually designed to learn like that, right? Because actually in life, we really don't have all that much time to sit down and instruct each child individually with all the specifics. So children are programmed, designed by nature to watch and copy. So beware what they're watching and copying.
Right.
Another way you can confuse a child is when one day a behavior is okay and the next day, and in fact, it's ignored or even praised, and another day the parent will get upset with that same behavior.
Right. And that boils down again, inconsistency. Today is okay, today, tomorrow's not. It just depends on your mood, right?
Correct.
And that's not fair on the
So-
child. So
Correct. So
we
it's
speak
tough
about
on parents.
inconsistency. Absolutely. We speak about inconsistency, but what are practical ways for parents to respond that is consistent? And it's time
Well-
consuming and it's a patience game.
Well, look, the thing for me is to understand, that inconsistency can happen in all sorts of different ways and circumstances, because,
Mhm.
you get it often, unfortunately, with kids playing parents off against the other, because there's inconsistency with rules between the two parents. And kids ultimately learn, if I ask mom, she'll say no. But then if I go to dad and say, mom says no, but I really, really want to, dad will say yes. And what
Yep.
that does is reward manipulation.
Yep.
Okay, the kid learns to play the game very quickly, and you reward that game, that manipulation, by giving them the yes that they want after they've received the no they don't want. But it unfortunately leads to the same thing as inconsistent modeling versus what you're asking the child to do, right? And that is lack of trust in authority, a disrespect of authority. Okay,
And that trickles
so
into
the
not just in
mild
your home, but in a classroom setting
everywhere.
or in a work
Correct.
environment. There's
Correct.
either that
Correct.
fear of authority or a disrespect of
Yeah,
authority.
and sometimes both. The mildest version, and this is the one I think that you were talking about earlier, and that you see the most commonly, is what I call the "oh, shut up" response. So the child learns, so the mother or the father will say no, 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 but eventually, after enough nagging, it becomes a yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what does that reinforce? Well, I'll tell you that what that reinforces is the just keep pushing. And then you get parents going, my child never stops pushing. Well, yeah, because you reward them, because
You
eventually,
reward it.
if they do it often enough, eventually you'll capitulate.
Right.
All right. So again, they don't trust the boundaries. They learn that boundaries aren't valid, that if you push hard enough, long enough, right? Now, here you go, because what have you got? You've created people who, as adults, don't respect other people's no.
Boundaries. Right.
Yeah, well, think about it. I mean, this is where the stuff comes in where, no offense. I mean, I'm not saying it's a direct one-to-one connection, but there's the potential here for a boy who will not hear no from a girl, because he
Yeah.
thinks if I keep pushing, eventually she'll say yes.
Absolutely. I think, again, Marion, we've covered so much. I think there's so much to digest here. So I think let's park it here, because I know that there's more that we actually had planned for today. But I think it's a good idea to park it here for this week and then continue on this, because I don't want to rush through it. And then there's so much to digest for parents. So let's do it in bite-sized chunks. But until then, do you want to give us again some literature that we can look up on?
Well, look, I'll refer you to the same book that I keep referring to. I mean, look, there's tons of information out there on parenting, not all of which is consistent, because I think our culture has tended to err on the side of being too permissive with kids now.
Yeah.
The trouble is, children need discipline, but they need discipline coming from a constructive and loving place, discipline based on what's best for the child, and understanding how this parenting process affects the child in the long term. So I think, most parents, given this kind of information, have enough common sense to pretty much figure it out for themselves. But it's the understanding of the cause-effect connection that isn't always obvious until the information is provided. And so I hope what we're doing will will give that information, because we still got quite a lot more to cover, unfortunately.
Yeah.
There's
Fortunately,
blaming, there's
because this is
shaming.
information that parents need. So I don't think it's an unfortunate series of events. I think it's a fortunate series of podcasts, rather.
Well, no, I do think there's a great deal of value for parents here, because I think if you know, you're prepared. I wish I had had access to this kind of information when I had my child.
I wish my parents had it.
I'm very grateful that my child and I are still friends, but I sometimes think back with horror some of the mistakes that I made. And I really was trying to do the best I knew how. I just didn't know. And unfortunately, when I had my child, the internet was not yet a thing, and this kind of information was not yet readily available. And there was still an awful lot of hangover from Dear Dr. Spock.
Right.
All right. So I would say, go to the that book that I've suggested previously, Growing Up Again. And Taryn, I really mean it. I think one of these days we should actually put all of this down on paper.
I'm with it. I mean it when I say I'm with that.
Okay, well, let's see what we can do. Maybe we can make it available through your podcast connection point, because I really do think if having this written down would also be useful as a handbook. And
do you want to remind our listeners what it is that you do and why they should reach you, and then where to reach you?
Well, I work with the adults. Okay, so I grew up in a deeply dysfunctional family myself, and I've spent my life trying to both make sense of it and figure out how not to pass it on to the next generation, which I got sort of better, at least, than my parents did. But I've learned so much more in that period since I was a full-time mum, and my child is now in her 30s. So I have a lot of additional information that I didn't have then. And so for me, I work with helping people to reparent themselves, to rewrite that factory setting that left them in a less than ideal place.
Yeah.
So perhaps they don't feel worthwhile, they don't know proper self-care, they judge themselves harshly, etc. So yeah, I work with reparenting, and dysfunctional parenting has consequences in so many aspects of people's lives. It can affect health, it can affect relationships, it can affect the whole of the way that your life functions.
Right. So
yeah.
how can listeners reach you?
I have a Facebook page, Makepeace Integrated Wellbeing Coaching. You can find me on LinkedIn. I have a website, makepeacecoaching.com, and I have an email, marionmakepeace@gmail.com. And obviously you will have that information available if people want to find it.
Right.
As well. But yeah, I'm always, open to new clients, because if I do my job well, after a while, my clients don't need me anymore. So
Yeah,
if I do my job properly, like a good parent, I work myself out of a job.
Thank you so much, Marion. We will chat to you again next week.
Thanks, Taryn.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning into the parenting. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions, feedback, or content suggestions, please email us at Taryn@theparenting.com. Please remember to subscribe, like, share, and give my aunt a 5-star rating.